Jess, you can start.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our third community meeting on attainable housing strategies. I'm Gwen Wright. I am the planning director in the Montgomery County Planning Department. And I wanted to just say a few introductory words. This has been a very intensive discussion about a very important topic. The issue of providing attainable housing for the residents of Montgomery County is probably more important now than it ever has been. We have seen a lot of news recently about all of the different problems of rising housing costs, and we're getting to a critical point. So this is the time when we need to talk about attainable housing. And we have made an effort to reach out to hear from all of you about your thoughts of how we should proceed. We've done that both when we were working on Thrive Montgomery, our update to our general plan, which has a wide range of housing policy recommendations. It's really an umbrella. It does not change any zoning, but it offers up a whole range of umbrella policy ideas. This effort on attainable housing strategies, we've been working intensively since March to get your ideas and thoughts. And I do want to be very clear that we have taken those ideas into account in developing recommendations. Your ideas, concerns, recommendations, thoughts have factored in to what the staff has been thinking about and what they are beginning to crystallize and put together as a series of recommendations. We are thinking independently. We're thinking with all of the input that we've been getting both from residents, from the housing community, from people who develop housing. We've been listening to all of those groups, and I think have come up with a set of recommendations that are pretty solid and that address a number of the concerns that have been raised. So I'm excited for this evening for you to hear about some of those thoughts. And before we get into our discussion of recommendations, I'd like to turn things over to Vice Chair Natalie Fani-Gonzalez, and she has a few words to share with us this evening. So Natalie, it's all yours.
Thank you, Gwen. Good evening again. My name is Natalie Fani-Gonzalez. I'm so happy to see the staff and people moving forward with this presentation. For the record, I haven't seen the recommendations that you're gonna see right now, but I look forward to discussing them during the planning board session, and look forward to hearing also your comments and questions. Thank you so much. Jason, back to you.
Thank you, Vice Chair, and good evening, folks. And welcome to, as Director Wright indicated, our third community meeting for the Attainable Housing Strategies Initiative. I'm Jason Sartori, and I'm the Chief of the Countywide Planning and Policy Division at the Planning Department, and I'm actually really excited about tonight's event. Before we begin, I did want to just take a moment to recognize the team that's been working diligently on preparing the recommendations that we'll be discussing today. You've already heard from Planning Director Gwen Wright. She will remain with us this evening to help answer questions you may have. We're also joined this evening by Deputy Planning Director Tanya Stern, Project Manager Lisa Gavoni, and Zoning Lead Ben Berbert are both from our Countywide Planning and Policy Division. Zubin Adrian Vala, who will be moderating the Q&A, and Jessica McVeary, who is serving as our Teams live producer this evening, are both from our Mid-County Planning Division. And finally, Todd Foley-King is our real estate specialist from our Research and Strategic Projects Division. You'll get an opportunity to hear from most of us tonight, but we also look forward to hearing from you. But with a limited amount of time, we may not be able to get to all of the questions and comments that you post, but at the end, we will share contact information that you can use to follow up with any unanswered questions. And so with that, I'll jump into just a quick overview of the agenda for this evening. I'll begin with just a couple of slides to talk a little bit about the Attainable Housing Strategies Initiative, and then I'll turn it over to Lisa, who will give a summary of some of the prior proposals that you've probably seen out there, other housing initiatives, and then some clarifying some terms that you'll probably hear a lot of this evening. And then several of us will walk through some of our preliminary attainable housing recommendations. And then Todd will talk about next steps. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, Zubin will be kind of moderating our Q&A. So in short, the Attainable Housing Strategies Initiative is one in which the Planning Department is evaluating and refining proposals and developing recommendations to allow more diverse types of housing in more parts of the county. The project is perfectly aligned with the actions recommended in the Planning Board draft of Thrive Montgomery 2050, which are the result of multiple years of outreach, engagement, visioning, and policy discussions. However, to be clear, it was the County Council that asked us to take on this effort. 6 months ago, Councilmember Will Jawando introduced Zoning Text Amendment 2007, which was aimed at encouraging more diverse housing near transit. Shortly after, Councilmember Hans Remer circulated a draft CTA focused on increasing housing options in our bus rapid transit corridors. After receiving comments from the Planning Board and more than 50 people who testified at a public hearing on ZTA 2007, the Council decided to defer all action on the ZTAs and requested that the Planning Board consider and recommend, quote, zoning reforms that would allow greater opportunities for missing middle housing in the county. The letter from the Council also asked us to provide opportunity for public input. After we received the Council's request, the letter shown on the screen here, the Planning Department responded by creating the Attainable Housing Strategies Initiative. So an important point to take away from this is that this initiative is a concerted effort to slow things down a bit. The Council was prepared to consider Councilmember Jawando's ZTA, but decided to give us some time to consider other ideas and to engage the community some more, and that's what we've been doing and why we're here tonight. Through Attainable Housing Strategies, we aim to identify viable options for more existing and future residents of the county to find homes at the right sizes, the right locations, and the right price points for their needs. And key to this is expanding opportunities for home ownership in the county. So not just rental units, but for sale units that can provide previously marginalized communities with increased opportunities to build wealth. And given that Montgomery County is a mature suburban county with limited opportunities for greenfield development, this effort needs to be focused on growing our housing supply in places with limited available space. So now I'm going to turn it over to Lisa Gavoni to talk about the different but related housing efforts currently underway and to provide some clarity to some of the terms you'll hear tonight.
Thank you, Jason. Hi, everyone. My name is Lisa Gavoni, and I work in housing policy for the department, and I'm happy to be here today to talk about the various missing middle and attainable housing initiatives that we have. So I want to acknowledge that through this initiative, we recognize that our terminology has evolved. In the past and in other initiatives, we have solely used the term missing middle housing, and now we are expanding our terminology to include a broader umbrella term that we are calling attainable housing. What do those terms mean? And missing middle housing is a term that was coined by Opticos Design to describe a range of house scale multi-unit structures that are compatible in scale with detached single-family homes. And attainable housing is a term that we're using that includes missing middle housing, that house scale type of housing, but also include medium and large scale types of housing products that are not necessarily house scale, and are housing products we envision not for the interior of single-family neighborhoods, but potentially along our corridors. Next slide. We also understand that attainability is a relatively new term to both the housing policy world and for Montgomery planning. We have typically in the past focused solely on affordability, which is a measure of whether or not a household can afford to live in that dwelling unit and how much of their income goes to housing cost. We recently introduced this concept of attainability in the housing chapter of Thrive Montgomery 2050, where attainability is being used in recognition that our housing needs go beyond a sole focus on affordability, but also include the type, location, size, and tenure of housing. And to be clear, attainable housing is not income restricted housing. As we'll further discuss tonight, Montgomery County has rising housing costs and stagnant income growth, and the median household income cannot afford the median house price in the county. With attainability, there's this implicit recognition that we need to build more housing of more types to meet the growing diverse needs of housing needs in the county. Attainability is also a relative term where we understand that land and housing costs vary throughout the county, and thus so does the sale price of housing. And what that level of attainability looks like also varies. We know that the size and type of housing has a huge impact on attainability, and something we'll further discuss tonight. But we have cut off over 1/3 of the county to any types of housing beyond single family detached unit without additional processes to build that type of housing. Next slide. The crux of what we are considering relates to scale. You can see here 3 scales, small, medium, and large, on which we are focusing. On either end of the attainable housing spectrum, you find structures that are similar to those just beyond the spectrum. For small scale, we are really talking about those traditional house scale missing middle types, that you see duplexes and other structures that are similar in scale to single family homes on the left. Likewise, on the right, our large scale look very similar to some structures just outside that scale spectrum. The difference being that those outside the scale spectrum are 4-story townhouses, whereas those classified as large scale attainable housing types are actually stacked flat with 2 or 3 units in each column. With these 3 distinct types of attainable housing come 3 distinct sets of recommendations that regulate different aspects of attainable housing, including the what and where and how the recommendations will be implemented. And when we talk about could you please mute? Thank you. When we talk about the rationale for doing this project, at the root of this effort is to make our communities more equitable and more inclusive by countering the historical discriminatory aspect of zoning. Zoning determines what can be built where, and by limiting housing options, we have limited who has access to many of our neighborhoods. If we want to diversify our communities, we need to focus on diversifying our housing options. Through this effort and in our equity agenda for planning, we also recognize the role that Montgomery Planning has played through plans and policies that have created and perpetuated racial inequity in Montgomery County. We have a long history of land use decisions that created exclusionary neighborhoods and formed barriers to resources and opportunities for people of color and other disadvantaged persons. Attainable housing strategies will not solve inequity in the county, but it's one step in many ways we hope to begin to address the barriers in place that exist for many households in Montgomery County trying to secure housing. The average detached house is out of reach for many Montgomery County residents. In 2020, the average detached home in Montgomery County was sold for almost $800,000 compared to $370,000 for attached structures. The graph on the screen shows various housing sale price ranges for houses sold in 2020. From this graph, you can tell that most attached structures were sold for under $400,000, whereas most detached structures were sold for well over $600,000. We show this to highlight the differences between the various structure types and the potential impact that size and type has on affordability. Unless you think this was a 1 year off, I checked MRS yesterday. And year to date for 2021, the average sold price for detached structures in Montgomery County has increased to over $870,000, an increase of almost $100,000 in 1 year. During the same period, the sale price for detached structures increased by $15,000 from $370,000 to $385,000. And just yesterday, next slide. And just yesterday, we learned that a Chevy Chase, Maryland house sold for $1 million over its asking price. And while $1 million is certainly noteworthy and not the norm, the average home in Montgomery County is being sold at 102% of the list price. I looked through 20 years of yearly sales data, and this is something that has never happened before in Montgomery County. There's never been a year on record where on average, most of the housing in the county was selling for over asking, even in the red hot real estate years pre-recession. But this isn't a 1 year phenomenon or even something specific to one neighborhood. All over the county, our homes are becoming less attainable and our neighborhoods are becoming more exclusive. In all zip codes in Montgomery County, house prices have increased above the rate of inflation. Using 3 zip codes as examples in Bethesda, North Bethesda, and Silver Spring, after taking a few assumptions where we adjust for inflation and assume that debt cannot exceed 35% of income and the borrower has no additional debt, we found that the typical 1996 house value and the estimated income required to afford these homes has risen dramatically and out of reach for potential homeowners earning below or even near Montgomery County's median income. A family would require $125,000 to afford the typical home in Bethesda if home prices were unchanged since 1996, except for inflation. Instead, it requires almost $200,000 to afford the typical home that has risen in value to over $1 million. And when you look at North Bethesda and Silver Spring, you find 2 zip codes where you could afford the typical home with an income below the median income if prices had increased at just the pace of inflation. Instead, you need an income well over the median to afford the typical home in those 2 zip codes. Next slide. Attainable housing is not expected to solve our housing crisis. Attainable housing is one component of a comprehensive vision we laid out for housing in Montgomery County in the Planning Board draft of Thrive Montgomery 2050. Thrive Montgomery has wide-ranging housing policies and actions that address and encourage the production of more housing to better match supply with demand. We also include policies that plan for a wide range of housing types and sizings to meet diverse needs and promote racial and economic diversity and equity in housing in every neighborhood. These policies and actions include key recommendations on missing middle housing, but that's just one part. It also includes the need for preservation and the creation of income-restricted affordable housing. Thrive Montgomery is a comprehensive vision that we have laid out. Next slide. We also recognize that there have been multiple ongoing conversations about missing middle housing, and I'd like to walk through some of those conversations and their relationship. Thrive Montgomery 2050 is a general plan that is a long-range policy framework that is the big umbrella of big ideas, and missing middle housing is just one of those ideas. As a general plan, Thrive does not change zoning. Thrive requires tools like zoning processes like attainable housing strategies, zoning text amendments like ZTA 2007, and sectional map amendments like what would conclude the adoption of the Silver Spring Downtown and Adjacent Communities Plan to have its ideas fully implemented. Through attainable housing strategies, the planning board and planning staff is being asked to consider zoning reforms that will allow greater opportunities for missing middle housing. And we have been asked to consider concepts in both ZTA 2007 and a draft ZTA from Councilmember Reamer that would allow opportunities for missing middle housing along our corridors. And you'll see tonight in our recommendations, we took elements from both of those in our zoning recommendations. Concurrently to this attainable housing strategies process that is looking at zoning reforms, we have an ongoing master plan process. The Silver Spring Downtown and Adjacent Communities Plan, where the planning board expanded the boundary of the plan to examine the potential for missing middle housing in blocks adjacent to the downtown and Purple Line. The recommendations for attainable housing will inform the missing middle recommendations in the Silver Spring Plan. In all of these initiatives, while they're separate, they are now linked through the policy framework and Thrive Montgomery 2050, and will be further linked through the recommendations of the attainable housing strategies. Next slide. When crafting our recommendations, we took a lot of inspiration from the draft recommendations in Thrive Montgomery 2050, especially when using this growth map on the screen now. The planning board draft of Thrive Montgomery 2050 proposes a recommitment to concentrating growth in downtowns, town centers, rural villages, and developed centers of activities or nodes along major transportation corridors to maximize the efficient use of land and to create complete communities. The draft plan includes a diagram titled Corridor Focused Growth, which includes 3 growth concepts, including corridor focused growth, limited growth in rural area, and rural areas agriculture reserve. The corridor focus group is envisioned as the area where future growth will be concentrated through compact infill development and redevelopment. And that's where we envision a lot of the recommendations that you'll hear tonight take place. The limited growth area is envisioned as a location for limited organic growth to meet localized needs for services, as well as an opportunity to provide a balanced and diverse range of housing choices to increase racial and socioeconomic integration and achieve complete communities in all parts of the county. The Rural Areas and Agriculture Reserve is envisioned for the preservation of land for recreation, agricultural, and environmental management for the benefit of the entire county. The major transportation corridors shown in the corridor focused growth diagram include several corridors planned for bus rapid transit through the 2013 Countywide Transit Corridors Functional Master Plan. These include Georgia Avenue, Maryland 355, New Hampshire Avenue, Old Georgetown Road, Randolph Road, University Boulevard, US 29, and Veers Mill Road. In addition to the BRT corridors, Thrive Montgomery 2050 also includes two major highways as growth corridors, Connecticut Avenue and River Road. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Jason to begin discussing the preliminary recommendations.
Thank you, Lisa. Now, what we're about to show you is the making of planning staff's initial recommendations. So keep in mind that these are relatively high level recommendations that we still have a lot of details like specific development standards left to work out. We are not presenting you with a draft ZTA this evening because we don't have one yet. And since these are still a work in progress, we're still looking for feedback from the community. And as Director Wright mentioned earlier, we've been listening and we've been fine-tuning our recommendations already based on the feedback we've received. And tonight is another chance for us to bounce ideas off of you and to get this additional feedback. So please do not take anything that we show here as final or completely fleshed out just yet. And it's also important to put this in within a process perspective. There is still a lot of process remaining before anything from this effort potentially gets implemented. When we go to the planning board next on June 24th, community members will have an opportunity to provide comments directly to the board. Planning staff will present refined versions of our high-level recommendations and seek guidance from the board on how to proceed. It's likely that we'll then work with the board through the month of July to finalize some more specific recommendations, including the details of any potential ZTA to be sent to the county council. If we do send a ZTA to the council, it would likely get introduced in September, and that would then kickstart an official review process, which means that it will come back to the planning board for an official public hearing, official review, and transmission of planning board comments to the council. The council will also hold their own public hearing with open committee work sessions and full council work sessions before anything gets adopted. It's likely that anything that does get adopted, whether it's a version of what we recommend, what Councilmember Jolando's ZTA that was introduced is, or if it's something more similar to Councilmember Reamer's draft ZTA, or some combination therein, adoption won't likely occur until the very end of the year. The last thing before I introduce our high-level recommendations, I'd like to highlight the three goals that we've been kind of working towards and coalescing around as we've been working on this initiative. The first is to create more opportunities for home ownership for more households in more parts of the county. The second would be to unravel the exclusionary aspects of our single-family zones and help to diversify our communities by diversifying our housing stock. And the third would be to work toward meeting the county's housing supply obligations and needs. So with those goals in mind, I'll now introduce these our preliminary high-level recommendations. The first is that all recommendations you'll see are targeted to the corridor-focused growth area from the Thrive Montgomery 2050 growth map that Lisa was just talking about. Next, we are recommending allowing, by right, house scale duplexes and triplexes in the R40, R60, R90, and R200 zones with conformance with a pattern book. Quadplexes would be allowed closer to transit in those same zones, also with conformance to a pattern book. The pattern book will give guidance on massing, scale, and design to ensure that these housing types blend in among single-family homes. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the concepts in here in just a bit and give some more definition to it. The third recommendation would be to create a new optional method of development to encourage consolidation and development of duplexes, cottage courts, townhouses, and small multiplexes and apartments near transit along our growth corridors and near the county's centers of activities. One of the details to this, as you'll see, is that we're not talking about everywhere. We're talking really about properties that front the major roadways on the actual corridors themselves. And lastly, We support more corridor-focused master plans to evaluate options for even higher density along some of those growth corridors. So now I'm going to ask Ben to take over and dive a little bit deeper into some of these recommendations.
All right, thank you, Jason, and thank you, Lisa, for the great lead up to this. So as part of going over some of our initial recommendations, I'm going to start with actually identifying a couple of terms that I'd like to define so that we can kind of start having a conversation around what we're talking about here. The first term I want to define is something we're calling right now our priority housing district. This is a specific district that is defined as areas within 1 mile of existing Metro Rail, future light rail, half a mile of our MARC stations, or a 500-foot buffer off of either side of those Thrive identified growth corridors. The map on the screen here kind of shows you the areas in the, looks like circles and then little lines along our corridors that are in the hatched. This is what meets that definition. Something I want to point out, as Jason said, they all fall within what we're calling that corridor focused growth area. And you'll see we keep referring back to these Thrive 2050 themes about where we're driving future growth. So these priority housing districts, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, where we are focusing some of the most intense redevelopment options, something I want you to keep in mind. Next slide, please. So the next thing that I want to talk about is this idea of the pattern book. And this is something else you're going to hear a lot about tonight. What a pattern book is basically a document that we're hoping to develop that would have a bunch of sort of pre-approved design options looking at the different types of buildings, particularly our duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes. Some of the things that would be in this pattern book would be some sample building massing, building placements on lots, ideas of how the height might be massed, areas where you might have your door placement, where the parking might go on the site, whether it's sort of to the side or behind the buildings, and maybe some other basic building features such as porches or dormers. And all of these would be kind of spelled out in a very illustrative way. And they'd be tailoring these options based on variety of lot sizes and shapes that we have throughout the county. The whole intent of this is to make sure that anything that we're allowing by right is still kept at house scale. For one of these by right developments that we're going to be discussing shortly, to actually move through approval, they would have to show that they are conforming to this pattern book. Again, we are hoping that this would include the duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes, and this is something that we are hopeful will actually start developing sometime later this year. Next slide, please. The third thing I want to mention here is this optional method of development that Jason brought up earlier. Optional methods of development are current processes that we have in our zoning ordinance today that allow flexibility in project design in exchange for getting some sort of public benefit out of the project, as well as a review by the planning board through site plan. We have 2 existing optional methods of development in our zoning ordinance now. One of them is the MPDU optional method of development, and the other is the cluster optional method of development. Just to provide the example, the MPDU optional method of development may allow for new building types and smaller lots in exchange for providing more than the minimum required amount of MPDUs. Clustered optional method of development also allows smaller lot sizes and different building standards in exchange for clustering the development and creating more open space and environmental protection. So with that, we're looking at creating a new optional method of development that for tonight, I'm going to call the Attainable Housing optional method of development. This would be looking again at properties that just have frontage right along these Thrive identified growth corridors, or that are immediately adjacent to our larger Thrive identified growth or centers of activity. This would not be something that would be allowed to happen sort of inside the interior of our existing neighborhoods. You know, this is something we really are trying to focus right along these corridors in areas that we either have high concentrations of existing activity or high transit activity. Again, as our other optional methods of development, this would be allowing some changes in development standards, but it would come at exchange for planning staff and ultimately planning board review through a site plan. And some of the standards that we'd be looking at with this are still in the works, but we'd probably be basing them pretty closely off of the standards we already have for our MPDU and cluster optional methods of development when it came to things like building height, building setbacks, and lot coverage that are allowed in those options today. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go back now over these next few slides to kind of talk about the where and the how and the why that Lisa talked about earlier on our attainable housing, and we're going to do it based on the sort of small, medium, and large scale that we presented earlier. So again, the 3 scales of attainable housing, just as a reminder, we have our small scale. The small scale we look at as being those duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes that we are sort of talking about as potentially being a by right option in our neighborhoods with the pattern book. We have that medium scale development, which might start including some other unit types. Those might include stacked flats, which for those of you who might be a little new to that concept, it's sort of single floored units that you might have 2 or 3 of them stacked on top of each other. These likely often look like either, sort of tall, skinny houses, or sometimes take the form of more of a townhouse. It's just the interior of the units. You actually have a different unit in each floor. Something else that might be allowed are small apartments. And when I say small, I really stress the word small here. We're talking, up to a few units in size, as well as potentially some townhouse type development. All of this would be sort of limited to that 2.5 to 3 stories. And when I say that 2.5 to 3 stories, if you want to take a look at the picture that we provided here, you have 2 full floors above grade, and then you have living space up in that attic space, really still trying to keep the heights in check. The 3rd scale that we are, talking about tonight is that large scale. This starts including things such as live-work units where you have either retail or home occupation on the ground floor with housing above it. Continuing with the idea of stacked flats, small apartments and townhouses, but looking at something a little bit taller, maybe going up a full 4 stories. Next slide, please. Thinking about where this attainable housing might be allowed. Again, I want to stress that right now our primary recommendations are looking at including these within that Thrive Corridor focused growth area, which again is that sort of light blue area that we were showing on the map before. That's generally areas sort of along and inside the Beltway, as well as going up to I-270 and a little bit up Georgia Avenue and US 29. Our small scale development, which is the duplexes and triplexes, we are currently proposing that they would be allowed by right and anywhere within the R40, 60, 90, or R200 zones with conformance to the pattern book within those focused growth areas. Quadruplexes we would allow by right in the R40, 60, and R90 zones only if they're in one of those priority housing districts, which, to remind you, was the buffered map I showed you that primarily focused around our transit stations and immediately along our corridors. The medium scale of housing, this is something that would probably be done through the optional method of development. And so this would be limited to right along our corridors. And again, immediately adjacent to our larger activity centers. And as part of this, there would be a regulatory review through the planning board. The large scale also would be focused along our corridors and more within our centers of activity rather than immediately adjacent to them, also needing to go through a regulatory process through the planning board. Next slide, please. To make sure that these developments are compatible with the small scale development, I want to emphasize again, we are proposing that this goes hand in hand with that pattern book, and that to allow these things to be developed and to be developed by right, the pattern book needs to be in place, and these types of development would need to follow that pattern book. The other thing that we're doing to try to ensure that these small scale units actually remain compatible with our existing neighborhoods is that we're going to consider a limit on the amount of land that could be consolidated for development. In practice, what this means is, we're considering, maybe up to 2 lots so that you wouldn't be able to have a developer come in and assemble like an entire half a block of a development, existing development, and tear it down and rebuild it. You'd really be limited to just 1, no more than 2 at a time, having lots next to each other that could kind of come in as part of a project. Those medium scale developments, the compatibility would be ensured because it's going to go through a site plan review through the planning board. As part of that site plan review process, there's opportunities for the community feedback at a public meeting that is held before decisions are made on those types of projects. Similarly, at the large scale, these also will have planning board review and site plan approval, also providing opportunities for the community to feedback. Next slide, please. In discussing the types of development standards that we're considering, right now we are not considering any substantive changes to the small scale development. We're not looking at changing setbacks, heights, lot coverage, or anything else that would sort of dictate building placement for these duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes. If the single family detached house fits on those lots today, these things would need to fit in the exact same envelope. We are not proposing to relax them in any way to make it easier to build more a mass or bulk of a building than what's currently allowed today. The only development standards we are considering some relaxing is the parking minimums, particularly within our priority growth areas, because we are looking at these being closer to transit and wanting to start facilitating, having car light households potentially living in some of these dwelling units. And looking at the medium scale type development, again, this is probably implemented through that attainable housing optional method of development. There's applicable standards for these sort of medium scale structures, aren't done being fully developed yet, but I would encourage those of you who are familiar with our MPDU optional method development or with our zoning ordinance and looking at that, we would be considering similar types of standards that we already have in that optional method today. For the large scale housing development, this would likely be actually occurring through one of our commercial residential zones. And for that to happen, this would require designation through a future master plan. Remember, one of the recommendations we were looking at was to continue promoting corridor-focused master plans. And this is one of the main reasons. In order to actually sort of achieve this large-scale development, we need something that's not one of these existing residential zones. We really do need to consider rezonings. And it's through the master plan process that we do that, in large part because the master plan process is able to fully test and measure all of the impacts that would have on the community as well as our infrastructure and public facilities. And recommendations can be made through that master plan when it comes to things like compatibility and design. Next slide, please. And thinking about how we would actually consider going about implementing the necessary changes to the code to achieve these different scales of development, the small scale development most likely would take the form of a future zoning text amendment that would amend the code for the R40, 60, R90, and R200 zones to allow the duplex, triplex, and quadplex to be a permitted use under the limited circumstances that we've talked about before in continuation with conforming to that pattern book. Our medium scale development would probably be implemented through the Attainable Housing Optional Method, which would require its own zoning text amendment to add this type of optional method to our zoning ordinance. And again, this is to be prioritized immediately adjacent to those Thrive identified growth corridors and right around those Thrive centers of activity. And as I've said before, the large scale development really would be implemented through master plan recommendations that would ultimately recommend probably a zoning change. And this would really be focused on select corridors and really only in select locations of select corridors where we felt that the ability to handle that higher increase in density is most likely. And next, I will pass this on to Todd.
Thank you, Ben. I'm Todd Foley-King, Montgomery County's real estate development specialist. We're exploring how to best ensure the resulting homes built are truly attainable in price, and we have not yet identified the best mechanism to do so. We're considering these alternatives listed here on the screen. That includes allowing more homes in certain zones to attract more and smaller units, given the link between size and price. Secondly, putting a direct limit on the size of units built, or limiting the developable area of any property and the total amount of land that could be consolidated, which would have the end effect of encouraging small units and limiting total unit size. So we continue to investigate these alternatives and will provide recommendations once we identify what we believe is the best approach. Next slide. We've heard from numerous residents who are concerned about the impact of attainable housing to existing neighborhoods with regards to stormwater, parking, schools, parks, emergency response times. And our analysis indicates that the amount of attainable housing built will be limited, and as a result, its impact will be commensurately small. But that over time, these units will add to our supply of housing and will help to make these neighborhoods more attainable. We also have mechanisms to mitigate the impact of new development through infrastructure impact fees for schools and transportation. And we're looking at recommending that the 2024 update to the growth and infrastructure policy focus on water and sewer. So while the resulting production of housing from these recommendations we believe will be limited, it still remains a valuable effort to undertake for a number of reasons. Firstly, in each neighborhood, the existing homes that are the most attainable are ripe for replacement, and there is an active industry that is going about replacing them. Under the current zoning, the only option is to replace them with large single-family homes, and those are highly expensive and not attainable. And we will show an example of that in the coming slides. The end result being, of course, that these neighborhoods become less attainable. Thirdly, even one smaller unit built is a positive step in the right direction and is needed as part of our larger strategy to address the housing crisis here in Montgomery County. This development will be incremental. The houses built will be added to our supply, and so the efforts we start today will build over time. And delaying is simply not adding this housing to our supply and making this crisis worse. Lastly, this is the right thing to do from the perspective of equity, enabling more families to access these high opportunity neighborhoods. Next slide. So to demonstrate the points we just made, we're showing here a portion of a neighborhood in Kensington that has had a particularly active replacement home market. The statistics on the right showcase the data on the housing market and the replacement home industry within the broader transportation analysis zone, the neighborhood effectively, and showcase that it is the most attainable homes, the lowest cost, smallest homes that are being targeted by the industry and turned into the most expensive properties. The map shows the replacement homes that have been built over the last 20 years with the ultimate sales price and the price that the builder acquired the property at to then tear down the home that was there and build a new one. While this neighborhood has seen its fair share of replacement homes built, most established single-family neighborhoods across the county have older, smaller properties that are ripe for replacement. These tend to be the homes that are currently the most attainable in the neighborhood, and under the current zoning, there is only one option for builders, and that is to replace these relatively small, affordable homes with large single-family homes that are highly expensive and attainable to far fewer households. This is part of what is causing our neighborhoods to become increasingly less attainable, as we demonstrated earlier. Next slide. So given the greater difficulty in building a multi-unit property as compared to building a single unit property, we believe that the attainable housing market would be a small portion of the replacement home market. And we have presented here on the map two scenarios of what that might look like. The first one being if 5% of replacement homes built over the 20 years in this one neighborhood were instead multi-unit attainable housing, and another if 30% of the replacement homes had become multi-unit. But 5%, that's equal to one property in the entire neighborhood, that blue star. At 30%, that's 6 properties, which is less than 1 per block. It's eminently demonstrated here that that's easily absorbable without taxing our existing infrastructure. But it provides more units at lower cost than the replacement home industry, which is the only industry currently building new units in single-family zones. Again, this may not be a large number, but it does mean that more families would be able to access these high opportunity neighborhoods than are able to do so today, and that there would be product that is smaller and at lower cost than what is being built there today. Next slide. Okay, so this is our general timeline for the Attainable Housing Strategies Initiative. You can tell that we have a very tight turnaround with a plan to transmit recommendations to the County Council in July. While this may seem ambitious, as we've shown, we don't feel like we are starting from scratch. On June 24th, you'll have an opportunity to receive public testimony and hear from stakeholders directly. We'll also brief you on our recommendations and seek your guidance on how to proceed. And then as appropriate, we'll meet with you in July to finalize the board's recommendations to the council as needed. In their letter to us, the council indicated that they would like to take action on this work by the end of the year. Next slide. We hope that you will all stay involved and continue to submit your comments and your input. Shown on the screen are some key dates for upcoming events and meetings, and this presentation here will be posted to our website so that people can explore these options to stay involved in more detail. I believe that concludes the formal presentation portion, and I will turn things back to Jason as the moderator.
Well, and actually, I'm going to see if Zubin wants to kind of facilitate our first set of questions here. I haven't been able to follow the chat here, so.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. And I'm going to send the first question to Lisa. And this is a question that we have heard quite often, which is, what's the difference between attainable and affordable housing?
Sorry, I was muted. You would think I would know by now, but I guess I'll just never learn. So previously we talked about there's a couple of different nuances here where there's income restricted affordable housing, which is affordable housing that is affordable through a deed. It's like our moderate price dwelling unit where it has income controls on who can live there. There's also the topic of affordability in housing, which is generally referred to as how much of your income goes to housing. And if you spend more than 30% of your income on housing, you're considered cost burden. So typically in housing policy, we like to ensure that households do not spend more than 30% of their income on housing. But we know now that there's a little bit more nuance there, that someone could live in housing that's affordable to them, but it's not suitable. So that's kind of where attainability comes into play. Attainability looks at the suitability of one's home to make sure that it's appropriate for their needs. And those needs might be a certain location, it might be a certain type of tenure or home ownership or rental, it might be a certain type of housing. They might, want intergenerational housing to meet their family's needs. And it's just that little bit of nuance that explains, our progression in housing policy that we're drafting, and that is in the draft plan of Thrive Montgomery 2050 that we're recognizing here.
Stay with you here for a second and ask you about the relationship that the planning board assumes between, or the planning department assumes between missing middle housing and its need to be near transit. Is there a reason why we are thinking of missing middle housing near transit?
Sure, I think that, for starters, I don't think it's just missing middle housing that we want near transit. I think that we want all housing near transportation. I think that we understand the relationship between housing and transportation, and that when we're looking at the environmental benefits, we want housing near transit to reduce the CO2 emissions from cars. Cars are the biggest polluter that we know, so that's one important implication there. And I think it's just good housing policy too, to want to put people in housing near where we have amenities, where we have offices. And yes, I recognize that COVID has changed a dimension there, but I still think that people are going to want to live near where there's stuff. You want to be near where there's libraries, and you want to be near where there's amenities. And I don't think that's going to change. So I think it's really important that we put housing near our centers of activity.
Thank you, Lisa. For the next question, I'm going to turn to Todd Foley-King. So Todd, this is a kind of the running theme in the comments and questions here, which is housing prices are up because of COVID, and there are other factors such as lumber prices, steel prices that have gone up, and that's what explains the short supply of housing in the county. Please respond.
Thank you, Zubin. The comment is absolutely correct that lumber and other construction materials and labor is extremely expensive right now. It may come down somewhat, but lumber and labor and construction costs have been elevated for multiple years now. It's also true that the supply of housing is particularly tight right now because the COVID pandemic has driven many people to look for more and bigger space. However, we have had a housing crisis that predates the pandemic because our supply of new housing has been quite constricted for about 2 decades now, and our housing prices have been highly elevated even before COVID. So the fact that COVID has sent prices through the roof does not change the underlying crisis that we had even before. It's just made it worse.
Thank you. And for the next question, I'm going to turn to Jason. Jason, could you, I think there's this theme around what we really need are higher paying jobs and job growth in the county, and that will start addressing our housing needs, and that will raise also our tax base. So that's what we should be focused on. Could you speak a little bit to the link between housing and jobs?
Yeah, well, and I'll welcome any additional comments from anyone else on the team. I think that, yeah, I mean, really what we need to focus on is kind of all of the above type of approach to our future, and housing is a big part of that. Jobs is also certainly part of that, and from a Thrive perspective, our economic resiliency was also a major element of Thrive. And so, here what we're focused on is that the housing elements, but certainly, attracting jobs is something that is important as well. I don't know if Gwen or anyone else wanted to touch on that.
Yeah, I would just like to mention that, really job growth and economic development and housing are related topics. When we've worked to attract new businesses to Montgomery County, one of the questions they have is there housing for our employees? Are there places where our employees are going to be able to afford and are going to want to live? And that's a combination of price, size, type of housing, as well as amenities. So we see addressing our housing crisis, and it is a crisis, as part of our economic development strategy in Montgomery County. It is not either or. You can't say, let's all work on getting more jobs, when our employers are saying that a major factor is there appropriate housing that our employees can live in close to where we end up locating jobs. The other thing that I did want to mention in terms of COVID is, Montgomery County is sort of unique in that we've been focusing a lot on biotech and laboratories and healthcare. And those are all jobs you cannot do from home. You cannot zoom into a laboratory. You cannot zoom in to a healthcare situation where you have to be there. So we are going to, yes, have some people who are going to be teleworking, but we're going to have a lot of people in Montgomery County because of the focus of a lot of our jobs who are still going to be commuting to work and looking for places to live to lessen that commute. So I think that, again, I would just say that the idea of growing jobs, growing our economy, and addressing our housing crisis are completely interrelated.
Thank you, Gwen. And Jason, I'm going to come back to you for the next question. Somebody's asking us about the process, which is why the rush? We cannot even meet in person yet. So what's the hurry with taking this process forward?
Right. Well, so in terms of the process, there's still, as I mentioned earlier, there's still plenty of opportunities for people to have their voices heard. And we think that, in general, there's been a lot that's happened over the course of the last year as everything has moved virtual. And that we've shown, in fact, in many ways, we've seen a more diverse participation of people in our virtual environment, in our virtual public meetings and opportunities to testify than we may have seen before. And so, as we go forward and we get back to a non-virtual environment, or where virtual is not the only option, we do hope that we can continue to provide options like this for people to engage with us in multiple ways. But, in terms of the process, there's still, as we go through the fall, I kind of want to highlight again that this has been an effort to slow things down, that if we hadn't engaged in this Attainable Housing Strategies effort, it's likely that a ZTA would have already been adopted earlier in the year. And so, we think that we've tried to focus on community engagement in multiple forums. And so while it's been all virtual, we had an advisory team that we worked with people from different perspectives on the housing policy. We had office hours where we've had an opportunity to meet with one-on-one in a more one-on-one intimate setting with people who have questions and would like to provide comments. And then we've also next week Lisa will be taking over the planning department's Twitter account to engage people on Twitter in terms of by putting out ideas and responding to questions and getting questions out there for people to provide their comments and feedback to us as well. So we think that we've been trying to focus as much as possible on engaging people in different ways.
And Jason, I'm going to send you another question, which you have answered in your presentation, but still has some popularity in the chat, which is, can you speak to the strain on utilities such as sewer and parking, etc.? And maybe an addendum to that question is also that one of the reasons we have this crisis to begin with is people wanted more space. And is there even demand for smaller homes?
Oh, there certainly is a demand for smaller homes, just even from the fact that we've, the homes that we have now, just by virtue of being smaller, homes will be more affordable. And, we certainly have a desire for more homes that are affordable to more income levels. And, in terms of impact on infrastructure and, with a lot of the changes that we talk about with allowing, duplexes and triplexes by right within single family neighborhoods, as Todd talked about, the impact will be incremental, and the impact on something like schools will be relatively de minimis, because you're not going to see entire neighborhoods turn from single family homes into a neighborhood full of duplexes. You're not even going to see all of those homes that are ripe for replacement. They're not all going to turn into duplexes or triplexes. So it's going to be, relatively de minimis in terms of the impact on schools. Water and sewer, I think, when we've said that there's an interest in looking at water and sewer infrastructure as part of the next update to the growth and infrastructure policy, which we take on every 4 years. And we're going to start that process in just a little over 2 years. So the next quadrennial update. In potentially looking at water and sewer, just the idea that much of our growth is occurring and is focused in areas where we have aging infrastructure from that. So, we'll see what we can do in terms of that. But, we think that, again, it's the incremental nature of this, which at the same time, we also see as a very positive step in the right direction. One additional house that's more attainable to more households is one additional household that gets the opportunity to have home ownership, to move into a neighborhood. So, yeah.
And if I could add to that, we recently, within the last couple of years, went through the whole discussion of accessory dwelling units. When that legislation was approved, we heard many people expressing strong concerns that the density in their neighborhoods would be doubled immediately because people would all build accessory dwelling units. The reality is that we have had some accessory dwelling units, but it's been a very limited number. You all live in neighborhoods, and I would question whether any of you have seen your neighbors build an accessory dwelling unit. Yes, we've had some, but it hasn't been the onslaught that I think many people feared, where we were doubling the density of neighborhoods. I think that this idea of duplexes and triplexes is similar. We will see some properties redeveloped, perhaps instead of tear downs and large single family houses, we'll see them as duplexes and triplexes. The good news is we'll see them potentially as home ownership opportunities rather than rental opportunities, which is what accessory dwelling units are. And, again, I want to emphasize what Jason just said, is this is not the only solution to our housing crisis. It is part of a whole toolkit of solutions that includes building housing in our central business districts. It includes converting office buildings into housing. It includes preserving existing naturally occurring affordable housing. It includes building new housing in up county, mid county, down county, in different areas. and it includes the potential for these kinds of attainable housings in our existing neighborhoods. I saw an interesting question earlier in the chat saying, will the planners please tell us, where they live? And I'm glad to tell you where I live. I live in Cleveland Park in the District of Columbia. In my neighborhood, we have single-family detached houses, we have duplexes, we have small apartment buildings, we have along Connecticut Avenue and Wisconsin Avenue larger apartment buildings, and they're all cheek by jowl, and they all end up working together and giving people an opportunity to move into this neighborhood. I know so many families that started out in this neighborhood by buying a condo in one of the smaller apartment buildings and building equity. And after they were able to do that, they moved into either a duplex or a single family house. It was a way for people to get their foot in the door. If any of you have young people in your lives, children, grandchildren who are in their 20s, you will know that it is very difficult for people to get a foothold into the real estate market these days. That's the idea of attainable housing, to say that there is a potential for a young couple to buy a smaller unit, get a foothold, build equity, and be able ultimately to live in a house like the ones that most of you live in. And I think that the goal here is not to transform and change our single family neighborhoods, but to add another tool in the toolkit that will allow for some attainability for young people and perhaps even older people who want to downsize yet stay in their own neighborhood in a smaller unit or condominium. So, again, I think there's a lot of alarmist talk about how this is going to suddenly change neighborhoods. I think the slides that Todd shared show that even tear downs are not all over neighborhoods. It's not like whole blocks are going through tear downs, and neither will whole blocks be going through the conversion to duplexes and house-sized missing middle. That's one of the reasons, and I want to emphasize that we as staff are recommending a limited amount of land for the house-sized missing middle to be assembled. Because we agree, we don't think it's appropriate to have a stick of townhouses in the middle of a single-family neighborhood. We don't think it's appropriate to have an apartment building on a block of single-family houses. We're talking in these neighborhoods about house-sized missing middle housing that could be duplexes or triplexes. We're talking about limiting the amount of land that can be consolidated to create these types of units. We're talking about ensuring compatibility through the use of a pattern book. And we're talking about limiting the larger types of attainable housing, the medium and large scale that were mentioned earlier in the presentation, to our corridors and our housing focus areas. And those would go through a level of review through the optional method or through a master plan and rezoning. So I want to be very, very clear that what our staff recommendations are not identical to all of the legislation that had previously been discussed. We have heard the concerns, and we are looking at recommendations that are more moderate. So I just wanted to add that in. Zubin, next question.
I'm glad you're still here, Gwen, because I think the next question I want to direct to you, which is, there are a lot of questions about the pattern book itself. Basically, like what its goals are and how prescriptive or not prescriptive will it be. So could you speak a little bit to the pattern book?
Sure. The idea of a pattern book is not to create a set of detailed design guidelines like we have in many of our historic districts that talk about the type of windows you can have or the type of siding you could have or that sort of thing. The idea of a pattern book is a little more like form-based zoning, where you're basically saying, here is the basic footprint, massing, height, and how within those, within that envelope, it's appropriate to create, again, we're talking duplexes, triplexes, quadruplexes, house-sized kinds of missing middle and attainable housing. So the idea of the pattern book, again, is not to create a detailed set of design guidelines, but to provide the kinds of standards that would maintain the house-sized character that will make these units compatible with the existing single-family neighborhoods. And so one of the things, again, that's important to note is we don't yet have the pattern book written. We are looking at trying to perhaps start that later this year. But we do believe that if this program moves forward, that it should not actually be in place for the single-family neighborhoods until the pattern book has actually been developed. So.
Thank you, Gwen. And Ben, I'm going to come to you for the next question or next consolidated set of questions, which is about consolidation of lots. So there are a few questions about consolidation of lots. What are the limits set on it? What kind of limits are you thinking about? And how will it apply to different zones? Thank you.
All right, thank you, Zubin. So when we're talking about lot consolidation, there's really two places it would be happening. One is for that sort of by right small scale, which I'll talk about first. And then the second is the potential that there'd be lot consolidation to develop some of that medium scale optional method development. And I'll talk about that second. When we're looking at this sort of by right small scale type of development, the lot consolidation, we're looking at having no more than basically two sort of existing single family detached size lots per the underlying zoning would be consolidated at any one time as part of this by right process. And part of why we want to do that, one, it is to help compatibility. We don't want someone, as unlikely as it is, to potentially be able to acquire multiple lots in a row and tear all those houses down and put back either cookie cutter housing or some other type of housing that we really don't want, that would just completely alter the scale of that block. Something else that I did see in the chat related to this, the standards really wouldn't change still. Somebody might want to consolidate two lots if they think it's more advantageous for them to maybe get a triplex and then a duplex next to each other. And so they want to borrow a little bit of sort of land from the existing one lot and then use it towards the other, and that'd be through some type of subdivision process. But we're probably going to be recommending through the development standards that there's still a minimum lot size that's associated with a detached house. There'd be a minimum lot size associated with a duplex. There'd be a minimum lot size associated with a triplex. And so just because you maybe took two existing lots that were next to each other and consolidated them, it wouldn't let you do one giant building. There would still be an upper limit to how big of a building that we'd be allowing on this development. And again, we really only anticipate this probably in pretty rare circumstances that it really is advantageous for somebody to go through that process. I think most of the attainable housing that we see in these neighborhoods is probably going to be one existing house on one existing lot, either being renovated or replaced with a new attainable housing building type. When looking at sort of that middle scale and the optional method of development, for that really to work, you are talking about sort of larger tracts of land. And by larger, I'm thinking anything that's more than about 2 times the size of an underlying, single family detached lot requirement in that underlying zone now. And this is, that kind of consolidation would maybe let you start looking at 6 of townhouses or multiple quadplexes or some of these stacked flats or other unit types we envision going in there. But again, this is right along these major corridors. This is immediately fronting on Georgia Avenue or fronting on Veers Mill Road or fronting on 355 somewhere. This is not something that we envision going into the neighborhoods at all. This is sort of creating that higher intensity buffer with the most intense development right along these corridors. Again, it's probably unlikely that somebody's actually going to be able to consolidate multiple lots, particularly in a short enough period of time that somebody's willing to sit on them and sort of play that long game to make a big project. But it's not impossible. I think, you know, the other alternative with that optional method of development is there are some existing just larger tracts of land out there that never got subdivided that are along our corridors, or as much as I think some of us hate to see it, sometimes institutional uses like churches, they either want to sell outright or sell portions of their property. These might be areas that are a little more likely to see this optional method of development potentially apply to them.
Thank you, Ben. I'm sure we'll come back to you for more zoning related questions. Todd, I'm going to turn to you for the next one. The question is, if there's a limited number of attainable housing being built, especially in single family neighborhoods, and the numerous people are interested in getting those attainable housing units, how are you going to prevent future bidding wars on this kind of housing, as well as driving prices up, consequently becoming unattainable?
Thanks, Subin. We do live in a society in which goods at the market rate are allocated through price, and this housing would be no different. So it is entirely possible that desirable units would have multiple bids put on them that push the price upwards, same as all of the market rate houses within this county. The key point that we have been making consistently is that the types of homes that we are looking to allow would be smaller than the single family homes that are being built in these neighborhoods, and being smaller, they are less expensive and more attainable. And I believe that even within the questions that have been posed to us, there have been a number that reference townhomes near Silver Spring that have been selling for $800,000. And I will say those are in fact more attainable than the single family homes that are being built in that neighborhood that are selling for $1.2 to $1.4 million, and trying to push even higher than that. So, you know, to answer the question, no, there's no government that can prevent bidding wars or bidding on a market rate good. But these would be smaller and as a result, more attainable, less expensive than the comparative homes that are being built.
Interesting question about what about small single family homes that already exist on smaller lots that are near transit? Could you speak to them a little bit?
Yes, there is very much a desire to protect the small single family homes that are on lots that are near transit. Those are a valuable resource for this county. Under the existing zoning code, they can be replaced by much larger homes by right with absolutely no input or review by the planning department. What we are proposing here merely changes the zoning code such that the replacement building could have between 2 to 4 units within it, rather than just one.
And while I still have you, there are multiple questions about this glut of office space in our downtowns, and why can't we just convert that to residential, those to residential units, and wouldn't that be a piece of our solution?
That's a great question, and they are right that office vacancy is elevated right now. There is on our website, on the Research and Strategic Projects website in the real estate section, a report from 2016 that evaluated the potential for converting office into residential, that looked specifically at this question, that did pro formas, that went through the process for how they might be converted, and revealed all of the opportunities and all the challenges. It's actually quite challenging to convert many office buildings to residential. They they are not necessarily the right shape and size or have the right mechanical systems that a residential space would need as opposed to an office. Some buildings are attractive and are potential, and we actually have an application under review right now. I believe it has an approved site plan to convert an old office building in Silver Spring on Georgia Avenue into residential. So there is interest in that, and we as a department are facilitating those types of applications. But many other buildings that have very, very large floor plates, it's not always cost effective. So just because that there is space does not mean that it is space that is good for living in.
Thanks, Todd. For the next question, I'm going to turn to Lisa. And Lisa, in the recent residential development capacity analysis, it was found by staff that capacity for additional housing is greatest in CR zone properties, but we are not getting as much housing constructed there. So why should we look at single family neighborhoods to address our housing needs?
Sure. So in the recent residential capacity analysis, we did find out the greatest capacity for housing is in our CR zones, and that's because there is no capacity basically anywhere else. The CR zones represent only about less than 5% of our total land, and we can't meet our housing goals and meet the supply challenges that we have just by building high density housing. We have to look at building more types of housing for more types of people. One of the other findings of that study is that there is basically no capacity in our residential detached zones, which is R60, R90, R200 that we've talked about tonight. The only capacity that's really there is large lots that can potentially be subdivided, and that's pretty rare. So part of what we're trying to do here is also how do we meet our housing goals? And it's by building more types of more housing and more places. And that's something that we're going to keep reiterating. And zoning is a big impediment to meeting those goals right now.
Excuse me, Lisa, while I have you,
Sure.
there's a sort of thematic question that I'm seeing in the Q&A here, which is how do you reconcile on one hand saying that this will have limited impact? Wouldn't that also mean that the housing production will be limited? So could you speak to that a little bit?
Sure, and I think we talked about that a little bit. While we recognize, like Director Wright said, that about our ADU ordinance, that change is incremental. We don't expect, overnight, if this should pass, that we'll suddenly be inundated by duplexes and triplexes. But one, we think it's the right thing to do to help meet our equity goals. And two, even if we just get one duplex or triplex, that's 1 or 2 more housing units than we were currently getting. And, you don't get into, when I talked about those housing numbers and how expensive and supply constrained our market is, you don't get out of that hole without doing everything that you can to really target housing production. And we're also doing a lot of other things too that I didn't even mention. The council is taking up the HOC production fund to build more income restricted housing. We've passed another of bills and initiatives related to building more housing, including income restricted. So it's really an all hands on deck kind of situation for the housing supply issues that we have here.
Thank you, Lisa. And I'm going to keep you here for 1 more minute.
Sure.
Could you also speak to this effort in view of the county's changing demographics? How can this help adapt to smaller household sizes and actually help seniors age in place?
Sure, that's a really great question, and something that we didn't talk about tonight, but we have in previous presentations. Montgomery County is diversifying it we're getting older, we're becoming more diverse, and housing needs are changing. Chair Anderson, our planning board chair, always likes to bring up the statistics that the most common household formation in Montgomery County is the non-family household, but yet the only housing available in most of the county is single family detached units. And so we need to build more housing to meet those needs. And also we recently completed an older adult housing study. We found out that 7 out of 10 Montgomery County seniors want to age in place, but the options are limited in Montgomery County and how we can age in place without building more types of housing in these neighborhoods.
Thank you, Lisa. And Todd, I'm going to come back to you for another question, which is, and this question also has appeared in different forms, which is developers build based on a profit motive. So if they can build a larger single family home instead of a duplex, why wouldn't they just continue doing what is working right now?
That's a great question, Zubin. And as our slides indicated, we believe that many of them will continue to keep doing what they are doing now. That the attainable housing market will be a smaller subset of the replacement home market, but that it is still very much a valuable initiative to undertake to increase the supply of units here in Montgomery County. There is the potential, and the reason we are pursuing this is that 2 small units can result in higher revenue than 1 larger unit. Costs for building multiple units are generally higher than for building a single unit, and it can be fairly complex, and it gets down to the individual context of the specific property at hand. We have presented a market study several months back for the Silver Spring project that has many takeaways that are still applicable here. And part of the finding there is that it is very difficult to build multi-unit properties. And that does reinforce our finding that we do not believe that this will overwhelm, or this will not result in entire neighborhoods being redeveloped into multi-unit properties within the first year that this is in place, or even the first decade that this is in place.
Thank you. And for the next question, I'm going to turn to Jason. The question basically relates to impact on schools. And there are some concerns about school capacity, and how is that Attainable Housing Strategies Initiative looking at school capacity in general?
Sure. So, well, I would say that if you're not familiar with the most recent update to the growth and infrastructure policy, which used to be called the subdivision staging policy, and many years ago was called the annual growth policy, there were some changes recently that kind of changed the way we think about infrastructure, school infrastructure in the county. And back, when we created our adequate public facilities ordinance in 1973, we were growing in greenfield areas of the county, areas that were completely devoid of infrastructure. And it made a lot of sense then to have a policy that said we're going to stop development in order to build the infrastructure that doesn't exist yet today. Now, when we've got this increased focus, as is even evidenced through attainable housing strategies, on infill development and redevelopment in our existing, areas that are already built out, the focus is a little different. It has a different impact on the infrastructure exists. It just may need, upgrades or additional capacity. And so the focus now is not on stopping the development. In part, stopping the development is part of what's leading to the crisis that we're experiencing now with the lack of supply of housing and the seemingly ever increasing price of homes. Instead, the focus is on how do we mitigate that impact. And so we have a new structure in place that says if a school is overcrowded and a developer is building there, and this would also apply to a property owner that decides to build a duplex on a site, if the schools are already over a particular capacity, they need to pay an extra fee that goes to help fund the needed school capacity. And the more overcrowded the schools are, the more they have to pay. And if it's not just elementary school, but it's the middle school or the high school that are also overcrowded, then they've got to pay fees for those as well. So those fees are on top of impact taxes. Now, in the past, currently, if you have a single family home in one of our neighborhoods and you tear that down and replace it with another single family home, it's a balance of 0, a net gain of 0 units. That person doesn't pay an impact tax. However, if you replace it with 2 units, a duplex, now you've had a net gain of 1 unit. There's going to have to be an impact tax paid there. So go into a duplex, go into a triplex, will generate additional revenue for school construction, not just through the impact taxes, but if the schools are already overcrowded, they're also going to have to pay what's called the utilization premium payment, that additional fee, because the schools are already overcrowded.
Thank you, Jason. And while I still have you, there are questions about how this initiative will actually encourage homeownership, and how do we know that these won't just be rental units? Could you speak to that a little bit?
Right. Well, yeah, and I don't know if others have some thoughts on this, but I think that we have an increased opportunity to have ownership with this, and this is one of the distinctions between what we're doing here and the idea of a duplex compared to an attached accessory dwelling unit, where that would be it can't be two owners, right? Either the accessory dwelling unit, the resident there is either a renter or it's the owner of the property and they're renting out the principal structure. In this case, there's the opportunity for it. So there's no guarantee that the duplex that is built will be owner occupied and not rental, but there's an increased opportunity of that.
And Todd, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, I'd also like to say that renters are also highly valued members of our society as well. And frankly, their housing needs are also important, as is home ownership. So the fact that this might be rental, I don't really see why that's problematic.
Thank you, Todd. And there are some more questions coming in for the sort of economics of this. So Todd, could you just generally speak to how you expect this to pan out? Because there are questions around housing is already very expensive and this is just going to continue that trend. Could you speak to the actual attainability of this in dollar terms?
Housing is very expensive, yes. We do, and we have continued to note that we do not, that this housing being smaller would be more attainable than the larger single-family homes being built today. I would say again that is what we are facing. We have a severe shortage of supply. And a dire need to increase the amount of housing of all types within Montgomery County, and that this is one tool among many that we are pursuing.
And I think, Todd, if I could add in, it's Gwen. I just think it's important to note that particularly in the optional method of development, we're talking about potential limits on the size of the dwelling units. And that does affect price. So if you have a quadruplex with each of the condominiums being, 1,400 square feet, those are going to be less expensive than a 2,400 square foot townhouse. And what we're looking at is the idea of units that actually are smaller in size so that they are less expensive. That also is the idea of sort of a starter home, places where, or an empty nester home, places where people who don't need as much space can find an attainable unit.
Thank you, Gwen. And the sort of final question, I guess, would be for Lisa, which is, Lisa, we have a lot of questions. I'm looking at, I think, if my math is correct, about 150 odd questions, and we would be here till tomorrow morning if I asked you all of them. So how can people get in touch with us and get their questions answered? Thank you.
Thanks, Subin. So we did receive over 150 questions, which is great. And I apologize if we weren't able to get to you tonight. What we will do is we will send out an email to all registrants tomorrow with a PDF of the presentation and a summary of next steps with our email so that you can contact us if you have any questions. We are very open to having an open dialogue with everyone, and we hope that you stay with us through this process as we work through planning board recommendations this summer. So thank you for coming, and we'll be in touch tomorrow.
And Jason, Gwen, any final thoughts?
I think Lisa did well there. So we look forward to, continue to refine our recommendations and continue to engage the community as we move forward. So thank you very much for participating this evening.